There was no single fashion or preferred style of dressing for the many people who lived in North America. Their dress was as diverse as the physical and social spaces they occupied. Diana DiPaolo Loren. Hi, I'm back. I'm Maki. Recently, I had to move my costume bookshelf, which, yes, there is an entire bookshelf for this subject. And I really deeply regretted every single moment of it as I was trekking up and down a single flight of stairs over 10 times. I had to stop multiple times because I almost threw up. So, that being said, I also recently bought 7 new books just this year, so I need to seek help. Initially, this video was going to be on a different archaeology book. Unfortunately or fortunately, for you and me, I was reading that book on an airplane, and then after I landed, I got so violently ill that I have yet to stomach picking that book up again. So, here is The Archaeology of Clothing and Bodily Adornment in Colonial America. Let me try and get the glare off of this. By Diana DiPaolo Loren. The book is really crazy interesting, but there's only 6 chapters, so it should theoretically be a shorter video. Of course, that's all sort of going to depend on how excited I am for it, which I am very excited about it. The book also uses sources such as artifacts from the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology at Harvard University, so yay, go Harvard. Anyways, that's my little snippet of it beforehand. I'm gonna start going through it chapter by chapter. You're with me. If you're not, you can leave. I don't care. Anyways, chapter 1 is going to be called Clothing and Adornment in Colonial America. The combination of clothing and adornment from different sources leaves an interesting identity. Archaeologists are going to often study things that are left behind or discarded in daily life. What is often, unfortunately, missed from this archaeological context is the information of gender, age, and ethnicity. This results in often a conservative interpretation that leaves out the reality of blended cultures. On page 4, what she says about this is that the strategies they use suggest a pattern of dressing in colonial North America that is best characterized as patchwork, a mixture of local and imported, combining native and non-native, handmade and manufactured on page 4. Some would argue that individual identity and clothing are at the core thesis of fashion. This is what the author argues, and I'm very inclined to agree with her. Without individual choices and opinions, the nuances of dress are never going to be considered. We also have to consider the effect that society and culture has on these clothing choices. Without the eyes of another or an audience, the practice of dress isn't going to be contained into the boxes that we know. On page 9, she says that dress is more than a surface phenomenon. Clothing and adornment do not just live on the exterior of one's body. How a person dresses, the sense of self that that person wishes to embody, is a part of his or her bodily experience. Now, Eurocentric arts and accounts are going to do little to show the entire context. Oftentimes, they are incredibly opinionated, denouncing the dress and the practice of savages, and how Eurocentric worldview is superior. That is why this text is going to rely on archaeology for answers. Archaeology looks at items at face value, and there is no badgering idiot condemning those of a multi-ethnic descent and hiding their existence. We do have to keep in mind the historical practice of archaeology and how often items are taken out of context when they're excavated. On page 4, she says that what these images fail to capture is the ingenuity and creativity of colonial dress, how different groups of people live together in communities throughout North America, consciously clothe and adorn their bodies in specific ways to create a sense of self and present that self in their worlds. This chapter overall rates at a solid 9 out of 10. So far, I am very interested. Chapter 2 covers discerning artifacts of clothing and adornment. So often, museum cataloging context is going to strip an object of its actual job and other uses. A chunk of organization is done by the categories delineated by a man called Stanley South in the 1970s, which is going to separate buttons and buckles from glass beads and knives. What this categorizing fails to incorporate is the use of items such as glass beads, whether they were used in a religious context, like in a rosary, or worn either on the body, hair, or adorned on clothing. This specific cataloging is helpful for museum context, of course, but strips the item of its other potential uses. On page 18, she says the process of storing and exhibiting objects is still hindered by colonial ideologies and the needs to informed by current discourses on the ethics of stewardship. The study of dress also must be interdisciplinary, and this is a thing that she very much sort of emphasizes, and it really needs to take into account social bias and tradition. There's a need to consider these things as opposed to just relying on a historical and decontextualized systems. DiPaolo Loren's research is going to be interdisciplinary. She states on page 20, this kind of research is necessarily interdisciplinary. It draws from historical documents and images and uses interpretive and methodological strategies from the disciplines of history and art history. This chapter also touches on sumptuary laws, which are going to be historical laws denoting what social classes, ethnicities, and occupations are going to be allowed to wear. These laws are present in colonies, but not as effective as intended, which is sort of the typical problem with the laws. Sumptuary laws specifically. What sumptuary laws do include as information are going to be the fashion tastes of certain social groups, as the fashion choices of the people are often going to be concern of those in power because, if you're richy rich, you don't want every person on the street to be wearing the exact same nice, fancy styles that you are because you're richy rich and you might suck. Anyways, I have two quotes for this specific topic. On page 25, she says that colonial authorities in North America passed sumptuary laws because people commonly used clothing in ways that blurred the rigid social and political boundaries elites hoped to reinforce. And additionally, on page 29, such configurations of dress were also purposeful, mixing fashions made for powerful political statements to blur boundaries of difference and allow for social movement. DiPaolo Loren also is going to stress the idea in this chapter that archaeology is often going to look at the body in death as a reflection of that body in life. But that's not necessarily true. In context, you have to consider that a body in death is often going to be dressed and adorned by others, and may represent the values of those people who are doing the burying of the dead body. This is a very curated view of that specific individual as an ideal, as opposed to what they would truly wear in life. On page 33, she says about this, the items of clothing and adornment found with an individual in death represent only a portion of their expressions of clothing and adornment in life. These items provide only a narrow view of an individual's wardrobe, their sartorial repertoire for constituting self through clothing and adornment. This chapter is going to be a solid 9 out of 10, again, because this book is kind of a banger, okay? It is kind of a banger. Anyways, chapter 3 is going to be enclosing the body. This chapter covers tattoos and scars, the trade of cloth, and even specifically shirt buttons. Tattoos are going to start as an indigenous practice, alluding to rank, knowledge, gender, power, and the practice of tattooing is going to be moved to Europeans as a sort of representation of the New World and the Europeans' place in it. For Europeans in the New World who have chosen to have themselves tattooed in the native manner, these markings, while permanent, were only temporary tokens of power and prestige because Europeans who stayed in the Old World would never understand them in the same way. In other words, the symbolism of markings worked only in the New World context. Another sort of thing that we had to bring up in regards to permanent body markings is what people might have done to those who are enslaved. So, branding enslaved people, yes, branding is going to be a severe show of ownership, especially if they're branded on their face. Putting into context, the sort of common practice of branding livestock is just going to further cement the idea and the concept at the time that enslaved people are supposedly subhuman, merely objects to be traded and sold, which is not great. On page 42, she says about this subject, in colonial America, the practice of branding enslaved peoples connoted complete power and ownership over another person's body, and control of all that person's bodily acts. This kind of body marking would permanently state to the public at large, for an individual's whole life, that the branded person was owned by another human being. Unfortunately, archaeology-wise, materials that are used for tattooing and branding are not often found. And skin with permanent markings is also almost never recovered due to, decomposition and degradation and the passage of time. Anyway, second part of this chapter is going to focus on lead seals. These lead seals marked rolls of fabric with the fabric type, taxation, and manufacturing information of the material. Lead seals are often the only parts found of these products, whether discarded in clothing factories or due to the material just being degraded over time. European cloth has also been recovered in major trading posts, alluding to their use as trade goods with other societies, such as Native societies. And don't forget the idea that trade moves both ways. She is going to bring up a specific example of a colonial settlement. This is the words for that settlement on page 49. She says that narratives from visiting dignitaries and colonial leaders indicate the settlers and soldiers at the site often wore moccasins, breechclouts, leggings in combination with ruffled shirts and waistcoats adorned with gilt braid. This quote is sort of going to show how fashion is going to develop with the needs of the settlement, even incorporating lesser native fashion and techniques. Third part of this chapter is going to be about buttons. Buttons and sleeve buttons are going to be used both for their intended use on shirts and also as adornment and ornamentation. Buttons are often the most recovered items at historical sites in a multitude of sizes, colors, materials, and designs. It's easy to wave them off as merely just buttons, but is there more to this mundane object when considering their context? DiPaolo Loren says, yeah. On page 53, she says that examples of buttons used purely as ornamentation rather than being used for function redound through Native American ethnographic collections. Buttons of various sizes, styles, and colors are found woven into baskets and threaded with glass beads in earrings. This chapter ranks it at 8.5 out of 10. I do want to state that for the chapters that are ranked a little bit lower, as in 8 or 8.5, because once again, this book is kind of a banger, that lower rating has more to do with my mental state at the time of reading, as in I was getting incredibly distracted by a lot of different things and was not as enveloped in the book as I usually am, and so I rated it lower. And then when I went back to finish the book, I realized that yes, the book is still a banger, but then I just decided to keep these ratings in as they were when I read it. So that is why, if you're you're rating everything a 9 or a 10, why is this one an 8? It's because I got tired. Anyways, chapter 4 is going to be attaching adornments. The chapter is going to cover adornments as seed with beads, pierced coins, and religious iconography and style in culture. Colonialism itself is going to be an extreme meeting of diverse cultures exposing people to new beliefs and ideologies. Often adornment in this period is very specific and significantly its own type of adornment, especially in colonial America. The beads that we're going to talk about are known as Nueva Cadiz glass beads. They are going to be used as trade goods and as a show of significance in native cultures. These beads are made of turquoise or dark blue glass and are produced in either straight or twisted designs. Historically, at this time, Europeans sort of gave little thought to the importance of beads, deeming them as merely trinkets, which then just brings up the shock of how many glass beads have been recovered from a myriad of colonial settlements. Glass beads are highly valued in societies of African and Native American descent. Often, only the use of beads in European colonial societies are as rosary beads or decoration for altar cloths and used in embroidery. Nevertheless, we also, can't forget the cultural exchange between settlements that could have resulted in those of a European descent wearing beads like those indigenous to the area. We can also sort of not deny the significance of the use of these beads. DiPaolo Loren states on page 57 for this specific line of thinking, when an individual wore beads on the body, they were an important visual aspect of how that person constructed his or her identity. Light is captured in glass, and this translucence was unique among much colonial period material culture. The second part is going to be studying religious iconography such as the crucifix. The crucifix is commonly used in Christian conversion efforts at the time, but is also additionally used by those being converted as a subversive way of protest and merely decor by those native cultures. An interesting example of their use in protest was in the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 by the Pueblo Indians of New Mexico, and additionally in their culture prior to the revolt. After the Pueblo people were able to revitalize and rebuild their traditional religion post-revolt, though the crucifix was a symbol of Spanish colonialization and oppression, they were able to incorporate crosses and crucifix into their arts and ceramics. Prior to the revolt, Pueblo artists incorporate crosses into their pottery work to misinform Spanish colonists, as the symbol was similar to the Pueblo depiction of dragonflies and birds in flight. Another subversion that they engaged in was sort of depicting religious iconography alongside or combined with traditional Pueblo religious symbols. There is one particular example that she brings up that is like the Virgin Mary as a mural and also depicted alongside Pueblo religious symbols. So this quote is going to be specifically on that example. On page 64, she says, thus, a combination of Christian and Pueblo imagery is indicative of strategies used to preserve culture and recreate Pueblo identities. It allowed for active, explicit resistance rather than the passive forms of resistance found in the use of crosses prior to the revolt. The third part of this chapter is going to be on pierced coins. Pierced coins are going to be used as beads, as talismans in trade, and as protection in both physical and spiritual ways. In areas occupied by those of African descent, pierced coins are often going to be used as a folk charm, ward off evil spirits and illness. They're going to be worn around the neck of young children while they're teething, or older folks to sort of stave off rheumatism. The particular use as a folk charm and as protection is also just not seen in Native American settlements, where pierced coins instead are going to be used as adornment on clothing or as beads for jewelry. One notable example, which I can bring up here, is this coat. It's a walrus skin coat with puffin beaks and Chinese coins. It has Chinese coins sewn on top of the leather, sort of arranged in a way that looked a little like armor. On page 70, she says about this specific example that in this case, the coins used on the armor protected the body of the wearer in multiple ways. Coins were particularly effective when worn as armor, and the coins that adorned the armor in war and ceremonial settings symbolized the status of warrior. There's also something to be said about the lack of coins and other adornment in colonial settlements. This scarceness of these items is most likely to be perpetrated by the puritanical belief that flamboyance and excess are going to be disorderly and uncouth and just downright wrong. When these coins and adornments are recovered at colonial institutions, there's going to be an observation there about creating something new in opposition of the rules that are in place. So this chapter rates an 8 out of 10 for me. Anyways, chapter 5 is going to be clothed in the colonial world. If you remember, we're only having 6 chapters of this book. I know, so sad. So here's the second to last. Anyways, this chapter is going to cover the multi-ethnic practices of adornment in colonial America. She says on page 73, the diverse ways that colonial people express themselves through clothing and adornment offer a discourse of identity in the context of colonial projects that were fraught with regulations, tensions, anxieties, desires, and tastes. The first section of this chapter is going to cover the settlement occupied by the Dutch and Lenape people on Burlington Island. This part covers materials recovered from the Burlington Island settlement that is settled by 2 Dutch families and 8 single men. Also at the site is going to be the Lenape settlement that I mentioned, from which contributed to a number of native-made goods being discovered among those of Dutch make. There are theoretical answers to this site, but the site is also going to begin to question and poke holes at curatorial and museum practice, as there is sort of an inherent bias that European goods are a novelty and that native goods are just exotic. On page 78, she says that the underlying assumption of such interpretations is that Native American-made objects could not have meaning in the life of someone with a European worldview. Oh my god, I've been doing this with a mic that isn't even plugged in. I'm an idiot. I have been holding a microphone for 23 minutes and it's not even on. It's not even on. Anyways, I can't be bothered to re-record the entire prior of this, and I also don't know where the attachment is for this microphone, so we're just doing it through the phone. Anyways, as I said, there are theoretical answers about the site, but the site is also going to begin to question and poke holes at the practice of curatorial and museum work. There's sort of this inherent bias that European-made goods are a novelty and native goods are seen as exotic. You've heard that. Now for you to hear the whole quote. On page 78, she says that the underlying assumptions of such interpretations is that Native American-made objects could not have meaning in the life of someone with a European worldview. When archaeologists find European manufactured items in Native American contexts, particularly glass beads and burials, they link their presence to notions of meaning. Often interpretations at historical sites are going to forget the reality and fluidity of human life, being that it's not going to be as consistent as customs of the time are going to depict it to be. For example, a Lenape woman is going to be discovered at this site on Burlington Island, buried with Dutch bodies, and despite the fact of this, the site was not interpreted as multi-ethnic. Rather, she was a odd outlier that supposedly the 2 communities lived completely separate lives. Anyways, the second part of this chapter is going to look at the Louisiana French and the Natchez people. Many of the interactions between these 2 groups are going to be sort of wrought with violence, as the Natchez people did not appreciate the French showing up at their doorstep and trying to convert them, which, you know, who can blame them? Anyways, despite other native people in the area opening to the ideologies of Christianity that have been brought by the missionaries, the same cannot be said for the Natchez people, as they supposedly preserved their strong culture identity through this. Colonial narratives at the time are going to maintain the idea that the Natchez dress changed very little from one account to another account that is 40 years later from that first one. Despite this, there is also a myriad of French items in Natchez dress that have been recovered from archaeological sites and gathered from historical accounts. Notably, one of these accounts is going to be of a Jesuit priest who wrote that the individuals who were spared from the Natchez massacre were a tailor and French woman who could sew. Excavations of items found at a Natchez site also do not match previous historical narratives depicting them only in ideal Natchez dress. Items found are glass beads, buttons, and even an individual that was buried in a Justicorpse frock coat. That particular coat is going to be a late 17th to early 18th century coat. Think pirate coat with the ones with the big cuffs. That's a Justicorpse. Anyways, page 83, she says that clearly the static visual images of resistance to European clothing styles that Alexandre de Botts and Lepage de Prats offered were not completely accurate depictions of the reality of Natchez clothing style in the 18th century. Natchez people wanted European clothing. Now, if you know anything about me, you know that I'm going to struggle with French words, so sorry about the most definite butchering of those names. Unfortunately, most historical contexts are going to bring in the idea of and the accounts of French people, so I'm in hell. Anyways, this chapter ranks at a 9 out of 10. Our sixth and final chapter is going to be Conclusions and a Backwards Glance. Colonial fashion became a hybrid of cultures coming together, even though attempts are going to be made to delineate these identities with official acts such as sumptuary laws. Those living in colonial times didn't just hang clothes on their bodies simply just to cover up. Clothing and adornment are going to be used to create a unique colonial identity. Different to Old World Europeans and even in native contexts, dress is going to begin incorporating European objects for adornment. Still, as always, there were consequences for mixing cultures. On page 90, she says that social stigmas, fines, floggings, and even imprisonment were among the punishments meted out for dressing outside of prescribed fashions. Some individuals were forced to dress in a certain way. Others carried the physical mark of their body's ownership by another. Also, when we're coming to the conclusions of this book and the ideas of colonial America, we really can't forget the existence of Indian boarding schools in the 19th and 20th century, especially those in America. Despite an attempt and effort to stamp out Native practices and ideologies, students at these institutions are still going to find small ways of resistance and rebellion in the creation of, for example, effigies. Archaeology now is finally reevaluating previous finds and incorporating the context that was initially left out in their research. To understand historical dress in colonial society, you really need to consult multiple sources to truly gather enough information to come to a conclusion. Current archaeological practices have finally begun to include cultural information from stewards of the land rather than just those of Western viewpoints. And they really begin to analyze the region of people that come from a variety of backgrounds. Page 95, she says, through archaeology, we can begin to understand the complex entanglement of subject and object, of bodies and clothing, allowing us to get beyond the single glass bead to the experience of the person within the clothed, adorned body living his or her life in colonial America. This last final chapter is going to rank a 10 out of 10 because it is baller. Anyways, this book is over. You've seen me struggle with technology as well. Final thoughts on this particular book. Remember, this is the Archaeology of Clothing and Bodily Adornment in Colonial America. Anyways, I thoroughly enjoyed this book. The Maki math that I do is in, and it's an 8.9 out of 10, which is sort of essentially a 9 out of 10. So yay, yippee, go this book. The author, Diana DiPaolo Loren, has a very strong voice in the work. It's not too opinionated, rather, you learn just how much time that she has dedicated to studying this subject. It reads a little less like a series of academic texts and more like an academic who is presenting their research to you. This book is a very thorough look at this period of history and the fashion of the time. Was it engaging? Yes. Would I read it again? Absolutely. Is it a beginner or intermediate text for fashion history? No. I would not recommend it unless you are interested in the deep dive that it takes. I will say that this book makes multiple important points regarding fashion, personal identity, and self-expression that can be applied to contemporary fashion and self. The author has a clear love for the study of dress, and it has honestly surely changed my perspective of how to approach the subject in the future. Another thing that we can't not talk about is the fact that this country, being America, has a history of erasing culture and pulling a sheet labeled Manifest Destiny over the less desirable parts of its past. This book respectfully approaches these topics with tact and seeks to inform those of reality of these moments. What the book does accomplish is that it challenges traditional historical narratives at the time. For example, Native people are not savages, and they are not so far removed from reputable society that they have become something very exotic to the Europeans. If anything, the book sort of cements the idea that with any new society in the blended lands of Americas, colonists will take and exchange clothing and settlement ideas with the native people. That Europeans did stand to learn how to handle the land from those that were there first. Have you read this book? I'd love to know your thoughts if you did, but also I super understand if you didn't, because it's honestly a very obscure text that I know is honestly kind of differs from some of the other stuff that I have reviewed. Let me know your thoughts about the book or the video regardless. You can also keep up with my much shorter, much less informative reviews on Instagram and Storygraph. Anyways, that's been me. I'm sorry you had to watch me wave a rubber chicken around for over half the video with no end in sight, not knowing that I was being stupid. So, anyways, goodbye.